And they essentially run the Krebs cycle in backwards. And they harvest the light, and they take energy, and they make oxygen out of it, which then you and I use to go and do other things to drive our energy sources. So here's fascinating little-known facts that most physicians don't know. Your cells, while you're sitting here, have about 3 to 20 millimeters of oxygen in them, partial pressure. Well, what does that mean? You're breathing oxygen, you're at about 5,000 feet. So your pressure here is probably about 550, 560, maybe 600 millimeters of mercury. But that's the total pressure of all the gases pressing down on us. But the oxygen is 21% of that. In your cells, it's constantly down to that tiny, tiny, minute amount. And your body maintains it exactly at that tiny, minute amount. No matter how much hemoglobin you have, or you don't have, or whether somebody transfuses or you're not. Oxygen consumption is dependent and is available within the mitochondria that make the energy, and how much oxygen is there is really important for this cycle, the Krebs cycle. And if you don't have oxygen, it dies. It stops, you become acidotic, and your cells will eventually die. They'll lose the ability to carry on all the other machinery they have to do, which is make proteins, move ions around, and do the things they have to do. That's why we think oxygen is so important as doctors. But more cool factoids about oxygen. The ATP production and the amount of energy production that we have is hugely dependent on that stability of oxygen. Now, if you're, I used to say Lance Armstrong riding up the hill, but not so cool anymore, not the publicly thing to do. But if let's say you're hiking up to the top of Devil's Thumb or whatever the cool mountain is over here, and you're stressing your muscles because you're not used to doing that. The oxygen content of your muscles is exactly the same. It's 3 to 4 millimeters of mercury. But your body has to increase the oxygen available to it by doing things which open blood flow. And they don't increase the hemoglobin or the hematocrit. All they do is they open the blood flow, and they change how the oxygen is brought to those tissues. So the oxygen and the evolution of oxygen and hemoglobin actually allowed for mammalian species and all kinds of higher life forms to actually evolve on Earth. And so one of the things that doctors always say is, well, the heart beats, blood goes round and round, and oxygen is good. But this is a bit of too much of a cartoony kind of thing for the reality of the situation. And the reality of the situation is very, very complex. And of course, that's Mount Everest on the bottom. And what you see in this display is that most of us live in what's called the oxygen delivery independence world. In other words, our bodies have a vast excess of oxygen available to us. But suppose you had a heart attack and your heart couldn't deliver that oxygen, and you got down to this critical point right here, then you'd make acids and you'd be down in this point of the curve where you're highly dependent upon how much oxygen your tissues can deliver in any given second. And that's like climbing this mountain, is that you're down in here. And that's called the death zone or the accumulation of oxygen debt. And we spend lots of times in our labs and stuff studying that and trying to understand how that oxygen debt builds and how we as physicians can either prevent that or make it better. If you can roll the little tape on this one. So the microcirculation is beautiful. I could look at this all day long. This is what's actually happening in your gut, in your mucosa, all the time, is that the cells are streaming through, and you find, if you can roll the tape on that one, you can see some things. These look like Pringles potato chips. Those are red blood cells lined up in the microcirculation. But what you find out is that there's lots of area in between each Pringles potato chip, and this is plasma, and plasma is water-based, and plasma doesn't like to carry oxygen. And indeed, the hemoglobin that's on those red cells is in a very fine relationship between one blood vessel and another, and it's being transferred backwards and forwards, and the flow in capillaries can be bidirectional. And the flow in capillaries, 60% of your capillaries right now, sitting here being bored in a lecture, are not open. No blood flow is going through them. They're on reserve in case you demand them to do something. So your body carefully regulates that. And we can tolerate extreme levels of hemodilution. In other words, very low levels of hemoglobin in hematocrit. And I was telling one of the other physicians just a few minutes ago, I've taken 3 people to below 1.2 grams per deciliter of hemoglobin, and every last one, remember, 14 is normal. I've taken somebody down to 1.2. Every last one of them has lived by knowing how oxygen supply-demand ratios work. So I'm going to move quickly through some of this, but to tell you that how oxygen gets from the red blood cells through the vascular wall and to the tissues is really complex. We don't necessarily understand it yet, but if we say that there's a resistance to oxygen moving from the blood, and that resistance is in the plasma, and the resistance is in the cell walls, cell membranes, and eventually into the mitochondria, it's really fascinating that those resistances are constant, and the only thing we can do is just change how the oxygen actually comes off the red cells and how many of the blood vessels open up and move things along down the way. Mother Nature's talking to us. She's telling us something. When we have too much oxygen, our blood vessels close down. Well, wouldn't you want all the oxygen you can get? No. If you get too much oxygen, you get vasoconstriction, you get high blood pressure, you close the blood vessels. Wow. That's something that is what we call autoregulation. So how your body regulates and gets the oxygen to where it actually has to go is highly specialized. And this is coronary blood flow, heart blood flow. Obviously, we'd like that blood flow to be constant and to be highly regulated, and it is, and it's dependent upon how much oxygen there is. We teach physicians this equation, which is the total amount of oxygen available in your blood, but this equation is totally dependent on viewing oxygen only in the large blood vessels in the red blood cells, and it says nothing about the microcirculation, and it's probably actually all wrong. If you knew that equation that I just showed you, which I don't expect anybody out here to know, but you went and you took somebody who's normal, has a normal amount of hemoglobin, and then make them anemic, which is what Peter and I do on heart surgery every day. We cut your blood red blood cell content by 50%, so we cut your oxygen content by 50%. Those people do just fine. Super well, as a matter of fact. They do better than if we maintain them at full hemoglobin. But if I cut the amount of oxygen you breathe, in other words, take you to Everest Base Camp, if I just dropped you there right now, most of you would be dead within minutes. And we've only dropped your oxygen content by that equation by only 18%. So the equation that we teach every medicine resident and every doctor in the United States doesn't really tell us anything about who survives and not. So, and it's all dependent upon making these suppositions about red blood cells and how important hemoglobin is, oxyhemoglobin dissociation curves, all the kinds of things that we've chronically taught. Now here's one of the great cruxes, which is an aha moment for me as a physician. Hemoglobin, the red stuff in our bloodstream, likes to hang on to oxygen, doesn't like to give it up, doesn't like to give it away. It holds oxygen 5,000 to 100,000 times as well as it gives it up. So if it was evolved or put there on Earth to give up oxygen readily, it should give it up equally as well as it takes it. So it says to me, and it bespeaks to me, that the evolution of hemoglobin is really about regulating oxygen to not flood our tissues unnecessarily with it. So I'm going to skip to the last couple of slides, which is that hemoglobin, which is the red stuff in our bloodstream, really is a Goldilocks phenomenon. It's just about being right. Now, everybody asks me and says, why do we have 14 grams per deciliter of hemoglobin if we can get by with 3? Maybe we're all focused on the hemoglobin oxygen carrying capacity because that's something we've been able to measure in medicine, rather than that's the real evolutionary reason for why we have that much hemoglobin. Maybe that much hemoglobin has to do with the regulation of not swamping the tissues with something that would otherwise be toxic. So let me go to the last slide and just simply summarize for you that elemental oxygen is absolutely key to our life on Earth. We live in a planet that supports us, and supports us because we sit at just the right distance from the sun, and we got chlorophyll, and all these wonderful things are going on. Dioxygen is what we breathe, and it's critical for our health, but it will kill you. It is probably one of the reasons why we age. It's certainly one of the reasons why we get sunburn. You didn't see it, but in there was why you get sunburn. The sun strikes your skin, it excites oxygen inside the tissues to a higher energy level, and as that oxygen molecule decays, it gives off heat and actually gives a thermal burn to the cell. That's how you get sunburn. Wow, totally weird stuff. And hemoglobin has evolved on Earth as a way to detoxify oxygen. And if we in medicine embraced that and said, what's the evolution? Why is it really there? Rather than worshiping hemoglobin as something that we should give during a transfusion, we might make some assumptions that would allow us to move beyond where we are today. And so it would be different if we looked at the world of medicine through a different set of eyes, through a different way of viewing it. And I thank you for your attention.